Hello and welcome to this quick and dirty startup for the Kodiak. As you can see, we've got realistic mode on for the engine, which is really the only way to do it. All the covers, tie downs and doors are closed, and everything else set up as we want. So first thing we need to do is we need to turn on the fuel. Check the levers. The emergency power lever must be on normal, throttle on idle, prop on feather, and fuel lever on cutoff. So everything there looks good. Now we've got the fuel on and we've got the levers set correctly, we can turn on the master and the avionics. We need the avionics because we need to be looking at these gauges over here. Fuel pump needs to be on for the startup. Once we've got that ready, we're now going to hit the starter. Now ignition can stay off if we use the high starter, that'll automatically use the ignition as it wants, or we can turn ignition on and use the low starter if the battery's low. So we don't really have to worry about that for this one. Okay, now as soon as I hit that switch, we're going to monitor the NG, which is this gauge over here. When that hits 14%, we're going to introduce fuel, which is the red lever over here. So here we go, start. I've mapped a view to over this side so that you can see where this thing goes. Okay, I'm going through 10%, 12, 13, and 14%. Let's introduce fuel and we put it on low idle. Okay, we're now up into the 50s and it's in the green arc, so everything in there looks great. Go back to this view and we can put the fuel pump into standby so it'll activate when it's needed. The starter has automatically gone off. We can now turn on the auxiliary bus and we can turn on the generator and the alternator. We should have had the beacon on already for the start. And we'll turn on nav lights and taxi lights. Okay, engine bypass. This one is quite interesting. If you're in a place where there's a danger of ingesting anything into the engine, you turn on the bypass so that any foreign objects that enter will get thrown back out of the back of the engine without going through it. So that's very useful for that. Also, if you're flying in rain or through clouds, you should engage the bypass. The downside of this is that it makes the engine run a bit hotter, so you can't use quite as much power. Okay, so at this point here we're ready to taxi, and I'll catch up with you just before we enter the runway. The one thing I did forget to mention is before we taxi we just need to put the propeller into full forward. Okay, we're just about to enter the runway, so obviously we need to set the lights correctly. Put the landing lights on. It's really about all we need to do. We can turn on the pitot heat if we want at this point. And the first thing we need to do is we need to put the fuel lever into high idle. And we can then leave it there until we're back on the ground, which is great. You never have to worry about that one again. As you can see, the thing accelerates quite fast on high idle. Okay, so we're now lined up on the runway. We can give ourselves one notch of flaps, which the plane likes to have, and now we need to determine the takeoff power. Now, it's not as difficult as you might think. There's a table stuck to the dash right here. Okay, we're currently at just over 2,000 feet and it's quite cool outside. So we can use a lower temperature, 2,000 feet, 1,790 foot-pounds of torque is what we need, which is this gauge at the top here. So we now scroll up the engine to about 50%. Leave it there for a second just to make sure everything's good. Temperature hasn't gone over. We're just under maximum RPM on the prop, and now we can go up to 1790, but I'll go just below that. Just very gently easing it up. You obviously just have to make sure that nothing else goes into the red. Okay, so we're all good. Takeoff power is set. Release the brakes, and away we go. Just going to set the heading to the runway heading if I can without crashing the plane. Okay, and let's get into the air. When we get to about 90 knots, we can raise the flaps. At this point now, I am going to turn on the autopilot into heading mode, so that we can deal with the engine. Okay, so flaps are up, we're in the air, and we're in the climb. Now you can leave it like this, but if you want to save a bit of fuel, you can bring the prop back. The problem is when you bring the prop back, the torque is going to increase slightly, so we'll pull the throttle back a little bit, then we'll pull the prop back, 2100 is good for the climb, and now we can increase the thrust again to get it up to 1700 for max climb. And that really is about it. The only other things you really need to know is before you land, you must put your props back to full speed, and again just decrease the throttle slightly before you do that, and otherwise your reversers won't work. And once you're on the ground and cleared the runway, you can put the fuel lever back into low idle. And that basically is about it. Nothing too exciting. I hope it helps.